For years, people tried to explain Phil Mickelson with simple words: talent, charm, showman, champion. But none of those words ever felt big enough. Because Phil Mickelson was never just a golfer collecting trophies. He was something far more dangerous than that. He was a man who seemed to need uncertainty. The safer play was often there. The smarter play was often there. Sometimes, even common sense was standing right in front of him, asking for nothing except patience. And still, he would go looking for something harder. That made crowds love him. It made rivals uneasy. It made failure follow him like a second shadow. And somehow, it also made him unforgettable. This is not only the story of a golfer, it is the story of a man who kept believing the next impossible shot might justify everything that came before. And for a very long time, the world wanted to believe it too. Phil Mickelson did not enter the game like a machine built for order. He arrived like weather: bright, sudden, unsettling, hard to predict. From the beginning, there was something unusual about him. He played left-handed, even though he was naturally right-handed. It sounded like a small detail, but when people watched him, it stopped feeling small. It felt like a sign. This was never going to be a neat, orderly life. Some players learn golf like engineers. They build it piece by piece: grip, balance, tempo, everything measured, everything repeatable. Phil often looked as if he learned the game by instinct, by feel, by some private conversation between imagination and nerve. There are athletes who make you admire discipline. Then there are athletes who make you lean forward because you are not entirely sure what will happen next. Phil belonged to the second kind. Even as a young player, the talent was obvious, the hands were extraordinary, the creativity was even rarer. Around the greens, where tournaments are often decided quietly, he could see possibilities other players never even considered. A blade of grass, a slope no one trusted, a window in the air no one else believed was there. That is a beautiful gift. It is also a dangerous one, because when a man discovers early that he can do what others cannot, he begins to believe he should. And belief like that does not stay inside sport. First, it becomes a style, then a habit, then a way of moving through the world. He grew up in California, light in a setting that seemed open, warm, generous. There was an ease about him people noticed quickly. He smiled easily. He spoke easily. He did not carry the cold distance that some great athletes wear like armor. He looked accessible. He looked human before fame had fully hardened around him. Fans felt invited in. That matters more than statistics. Many champions are respected, far fewer are loved. Phil had that rare quality that numbers cannot measure. People enjoyed watching him exist, even before the biggest victories, before the great failures, before the headlines that complicated everything. He already had presence. You could feel it in the gallery. A different kind of attention followed him, not the silence reserved for fear, something warmer than that, something more curious. People did not only want to know whether he would win, they wanted to know what he might try. And hidden inside that affection was the first clue to the life he would build. Crowds were not falling in love with safety. They were falling in love with risk, wearing a smile. That can be a wonderful thing. It can also become a trap, because once the world starts rewarding you for being fearless, caution begins to feel like betrayal. Phil Mickelson was still young then. The future was wide open. Talent was on his side. Fame was beginning to move toward him. The game seemed ready to offer him almost everything. But even then, before the biggest stages, before the richest prizes, before the losses that would ache for years, one quiet truth was already forming. Safe was never going to be enough for him. The years ahead would prove something important. Talent was never the mystery. The real mystery was what a man does when talent alone no longer satisfies him. By the time Phil Mickelson entered the professional world, in full, golf itself was changing. Television was growing. Money was growing. Corporate attention was growing. The sport was becoming louder, richer, more visible. It was beginning to understand its own commercial power. And into that brighter light stepped a player who seemed made for attention. Some champions command a room through silence. Phil did it through energy. He moved with urgency. He played with visible emotion. He let people see the things many great athletes try to hide: a grin after a daring shot, a raised fist after a putt, a look in his eyes that said he knew exactly how thin the margin had been between brilliance and embarrassment. He did not behave like a monument. He behaved like a man inside the fight. That made him easy to connect with. But connection does not guarantee control. And very quickly another truth arrived. Phil Mickelson was not stepping into an empty era. He was stepping into the age of Tiger Woods. That changed everything. In another time, Phil might have become the defining force of his generation. In another time, the spotlight might have belonged to him more often. In another time, his flaws might have looked smaller because they would not have been standing beside greatness, so absolute, so efficient, so intimidating. But history does not deal in ideal circumstances. It deals in what happened. And what happened was this. Whenever Phil rose somewhere nearby stood Tiger. One man looked built in a laboratory of discipline. The other looked built from instinct and nerve. One made dominance feel cold and inevitable. The other made possibility feel alive. It was more than a rivalry of players. It was a rivalry of emotional languages. Tiger made people feel awe. Phil made people feel tension. Tiger often looked untouchable. Phil looked human. And strange as it sounds, that humanity made some people hold him even closer. They did not see perfection in him. They saw themselves. A person trying something difficult. A person making mistakes. A person refusing to stop trying anyway. That kind of identification creates a different kind of loyalty. Fear makes distance. Love makes forgiveness. And forgiveness would matter later. Because while Tiger often looked like the answer before the question was even asked, Phil looked like a man inventing the answer while the room was still watching. That is more fragile. It is also more emotionally gripping. The problem, of course, is that once the world decides you are the entertainer, it quietly asks you to keep performing. When the world calls you fearless, it becomes harder to choose restraint. When the crowd waits for magic, ordinary success can begin to feel like disappointment. That is how traps are built around gifted people, not always through cruelty, sometimes through applause. There were victories, of course, important ones, major ones, enough to build a career that most players would consider a dream. Yet even in triumph, there was often another story running underneath the result. What will he try next? Not whether he will make par, not whether he can stay patient, not whether he can accept what the course is giving him. What will he try next? That question followed him because he had trained the world to ask it. And questions like that can become heavy things to carry. Then came the losses. Not ordinary losses. Not forgettable afternoons. The kind that stay alive in public memory because everyone watching can feel the moment slipping away before it is gone. A decision too bold. A line too dangerous. A swing too hungry. The sort of choices that look heroic when they work and painful when they do not. For some athletes, failure teaches caution. For Phil Mickelson, failure often seemed to make the next gamble even more tempting. That is rare. And it is costly, because each heartbreak did more than remove a trophy. It strengthened the legend already forming around him, the genius who could do anything, the champion who might do anything, the man who seemed one decision away from glory or disaster every time the pressure climbed. Crowds could not look away, neither perhaps could he. Few moments captured that better than the U.S. Open heartbreaks that seemed to stalk him through the years. At Winged Foot, in 2006, with a major in his hands and history waiting, he made the kind of decision only Phil Mickelson would make in that moment. Not the safe line. Not the patient line. The daring line. The kind that had built his myth. The kind that could still betray him. When it went wrong, it did not feel like a simple sporting error. It felt like revelation. Not because he lacked talent, not because he lacked courage, but because for one brutal moment the whole public could see the tension at the center of his life. He did not only lose, he lost in a way that seemed to expose him. That wound stays longer. There are defeats that disappear into record books. His did not. They lived in highlight reels, in commentary booths, in conversations years later, in the tone people use when speaking about brilliance that might have owned even more history. And still people stayed with him. That matters. Many athletes are forgiven because they win. Phil was often forgiven because he remained recognizably human. He could frustrate you and charm you in the same afternoon. He could make the wrong decision, then walk into the aftermath with a smile that somehow did not feel entirely false. He never seemed carved in stone. He seemed improvised. For audiences, that is hard to resist. Because perfection may inspire from a distance. Imperfection sits beside you. That is why people loved him, even when he was driving them mad. Tiger often felt like destiny. Phil felt like hope mixed with anxiety. Tiger made people wonder how far greatness could go. Phil made people wonder whether beauty and damage were sometimes born from the same instinct. And that instinct did not stay on the course. Success casts long shadows. Fame creates appetites. Wealth opens doors that do not always lead to peace. Public love can hide private restlessness. The same hunger that chases one more impossible shot can start looking elsewhere for that same feeling. More motion, more risk, more action. More than enough somehow, never feeling like enough. This is where many stories become simpler than the truth. People like heroes, people like villains, both are easy to understand. But human beings are usually built from contradictions. Phil Mickelson was no exception. He could appear warm, funny, generous, deeply aware of fans, seemingly alive to the theater of the game and the pleasure of sharing it. He could also leave people wondering what appetite was driving him now and where exactly it would stop. Over time, admiration became more complicated. Affection became more cautious. Questions began standing beside applause. Rumors about gambling did not feel disconnected from his golf. That was part of what made them so haunting. Whether fair or unfair in every detail, they fit too neatly into the larger pattern people had already been watching for years. The same mind that could not resist a daring line on a golf course seemed drawn to risk in life itself. Not because those things are identical, they are not, but because they appeared to come from the same restless place. A man who could not always leave uncertainty alone. That is the danger of becoming famous for one part of yourself. The world keeps rewarding it. Until even you begin to believe it is all you are. By now, Phil Mickelson was no longer just a golfer. He had become a feeling people recognized instantly. Confidence mixed with chaos. Charm mixed with volatility. The possibility of something unforgettable followed closely by the possibility of something painful. Very few athletes live inside both spaces at once. Phil did. And that double life made him magnetic. When he stood over a difficult shot, galleries did not simply watch. They leaned in. They expected courage. They expected imagination. They expected the moment to belong to him somehow, even when logic suggested otherwise. That kind of expectation can feel like love, but love has weight, especially when it arrives tied to a version of you that must always be fed. There were days patience might have been enough. There were tournaments discipline might have won quietly. There were moments the wise decision stood in plain sight, asking for nothing except restraint. Yet restraint can feel unnatural to a man who built his legend doing the opposite. So the bold line remained tempting. The risky shot remained beautiful. The hard road remained strangely familiar. And beauty can be expensive. Some defeats hurt because they are close. Others hurt because they reveal something. Phil's most painful losses often carried a second wound inside them. They did not only say he had failed, they seemed to ask whether he had chosen failure the moment he refused the simpler path. Was it courage? Was it pride? Was it instinct? Or was it the inability to stop being the man everyone came to see? That question can follow a person long after the crowd goes home. Then came a new, harsher complication. As the world of professional golf fractured, Phil Mickelson moved toward one of the most controversial chapters of his life. By then he was older, richer, more famous, more vulnerable to judgment, not less. When the Saudi-backed LIV golf project emerged and Phil became associated with it, the public reaction was not simple disappointment. It felt like moral confusion layered over a story that was already unstable. People who had loved him for decades were forced to ask a new kind of question. What exactly is driving him now? Was this just another risk, another provocation, another example of a man who believed the normal rules did not quite apply to him? Or had the appetite for motion, leverage, and high stakes finally overtaken the better parts of his legacy? That moment mattered because it changed the emotional chemistry around his name. For years, the public had forgiven him because he felt human. But controversy works differently than a bad shot. A bad shot can be folded back into personality. Moral uncertainty is heavier. It lingers. It stains. It makes affection more cautious. The smiling risk-taker was no longer only entertaining. He was becoming difficult to explain, and once questions enter a legacy, they rarely leave. For some men, that would have been the slow ending. A long fade. A softer voice. A respectful exit while the memories were still kind. But Phil Mickelson had never lived like that, and when many believed the final chapters had already been written, he produced the most improbable victory of his life. Age is supposed to explain what comes next. It tells athletes to lower the ceiling, to accept smaller dreams, to become memory before they are ready. Sport can be ruthless that way. It worships youth in public, then quietly discards whoever can no longer move like yesterday. By the time Phil Mickelson reached that stage, many had already placed him where aging champions are usually placed. In the past tense, they still respected the name. They still remembered the highlights. They still spoke about the creativity, the courage, the old magic around the greens. But respect is not the same as belief, and belief had become scarce. The body slows first. Recovery takes longer. Small pains become daily companions. Confidence no longer arrives just because it once did. Younger men step forward carrying fresh power, fresh certainty, fresh legs. That is how eras change, not with an announcement. With footsteps. Phil knew all of this. He did not need anyone to explain time to him. Every athlete eventually learns that the body keeps a more honest calendar than the one on the wall. And yet some people hear limits as information. Others hear them as invitation. He had spent a lifetime being told what the sensible play looked like. He rarely built his identity around sensible things. So when the world began speaking to him in the language of decline, he answered the only way that still felt natural, by trying something difficult. What happened at the PGA Championship in 2021 felt larger than a tournament. It felt like an argument with time itself. Against younger men, against louder assumptions, against the ordinary logic of aging, Phil Mickelson did something the sporting world had nearly stopped imagining. He did not arrive as the future. He arrived as memory, scar tissue, cunning nerve, and one last violent refusal to disappear. And somehow it was enough. The victory carried a different sound than the winds of youth. Not awe, recognition. People were not only cheering a champion, they were cheering the refusal to become irrelevant. They were cheering everyone who had ever been told their best years were already behind them. They were cheering the possibility that history can still move when everyone assumes it has settled. There are victories built on dominance. This was not one of them. This was built on endurance, on surviving mistakes, on surviving doubt, on surviving public judgment, on surviving the younger version of yourself who once believed everything had to happen quickly. He was older now. The smile meant something different. The celebrations felt heavier. Even the way people looked at him had changed. Years earlier, they looked for fireworks. Now they looked for meaning. That is one of time's strangest gifts. It can take speed. It can take certainty. Sometimes it gives depth in return. For one brief, extraordinary moment, all the contradictions inside his life stood together without fighting each other. The reckless prodigy, the beloved entertainer, the man of painful losses, the public figure, shadowed by appetite and controversy, the aging champion refusing the script, all of them were there, and all of them crossed the line together. That is why the moment felt so large. Not because it erased everything that had gone wrong, but because it forced the world to look at the whole man again, and the whole man was never simple. Not a saint, not a villain, not a mystery that can be solved cleanly in one sentence. That is why he remains interesting. Some careers can be explained by numbers, wins, majors, records, rankings. Put them in order, and the story feels complete. Phil Mickelson resists that kind of order. The trophies matter, the majors matter, the longevity matters. But none of those things fully explain why people kept watching him, why they argued about him, why disappointment and admiration so often lived side by side whenever his name was mentioned. Statistics can measure results. They struggle to measure tension. And tension was always the true center of his story. The tension between brilliance and impatience, between instinct and discipline, between warmth and suspicion, between what he gave people and what he risked losing in himself. That is harder to archive, but it is easier to remember. Years from now, many people may forget exact leaderboards. They may forget which round began with a lead and ended in a stumble. Memory is selective that way. It protects feeling more carefully than detail. What they may remember instead is the sensation, the sense that anything might happen when he was there, the strange trust that even disaster could become compelling, the uneasy realization that courage and recklessness sometimes wear the same face, and you only know which one you witnessed after the ball lands. Very few athletes give audiences that kind of uncertainty. Most greatness arrives polished, controlled, explained by systems and routines. His often arrived with its tie loosened. That made it messier. It also made it alive. There is a reason some people felt closer to Phil Mickelson than to players who were more efficient, more predictable, perhaps even more complete. Perfection impresses from a distance. Imperfection sits beside you. And for all the noise that followed him, all the headlines, all the arguments over choices made on and off the course, he never became emotionally distant from the public imagination. Complicated, yes, but distant, no. That is rare. Because fame usually turns human beings into symbols. Symbols are easier to praise, easier to attack, easier to misunderstand. Phil spent years becoming one thing after another in the eyes of the world. Showman, choker, champion, gambler, survivor, problem, legend. Perhaps the truth was never any single word. Perhaps the truth was movement itself. A man still reaching, still risking, still believing one more bold act might change the story. Some people spend their careers proving how disciplined they were. Phil Mickelson spent his showing what desire looks like when it never fully learns to rest. Sometimes desire creates beauty. Sometimes it destroys judgment. Sometimes, against all reason, it wins one more time. That is why his story endures. Not because it was perfect, because it was human,